you might say it comes naturally, because they would never have gotten to that point unless they'd internalized those values. But it's also constrained. If they stop doing it, their stock's going to decline and so on and so forth, and somebody else will, they'll be bought up and so on. Now, pretty much the same is true of these other institutions. If some segment of the political system, suppose we had an authentic political party reflecting the needs of the special interests, the population, it would no longer be supported. It would be denounced by the information system. It would be condemned for being anti-American or subversive and so on. It would not even have the minimal resources to keep functioning. And since we don't have a network of popular structures to sustain it, it would disappear.
You've said that the primary function of the mass media is to mobilize public support for the special interests that dominate the government and the private sector. But that's not how the media see it. They claim, we claim, that our news judgments rest on unbiased, objective criteria. Yeah, that's how we see it.
Yeah, but in fact, the chairman of the board also sees what he is doing as a service to humanity.
You know, we like a lobster in the trap, we can't see it close behind us?
Well, the point is that no one would even make it to a high decision-making position in the media, whether as columnist or managing editor or whatever, unless they had already internalized the required values.
Internalized?
They believe them. There's a number of things you have to believe to make it to top managerial positions. You have to believe that the United States is unique in history in that it acts from benevolent motives. Now, benevolent motives are not properties of states, whether it's the United States or any other one. They don't have, it's meaningless to talk about.
You're saying that the United States can act for...
I mean, it acts because of the interests of groups that have power within it, like any other society. But anyone who believes this truism is already excluded. You have to believe that whatever the United States does is defensive. If we bomb South Vietnam, we're defending South Vietnam. If the Russians invade Afghanistan, that's not defense. Now, of course, I suppose if you go to the Politburo, they'll tell you they're defending Afghanistan. They're defending it against terrorists supported from the outside. And of course, there's a, we know that they'll in fact even tell you they were invited in. And there's a kind of an element of truth to all of that, but we naturally dismiss it as nonsense. On the other hand, when we create a government in South Vietnam to invite us in, and we attack the population of South Vietnam, and we bomb people to drive them into concentration camps to separate them from the guerrillas who we concede they're supporting and so on, we're defending South Vietnam. And anyone who doesn't agree with this is not part of the system.
You're equating the Soviet Union and the United States, and the Gene Kirkpatricks and others would say, of course, that's the fundamental fallacy of Dr. Chomsky's approach, is that he is saying there is a moral equivalency.
I don't say anything of the kind. These notions are in fact inventions of the Gene Kirkpatricks and other reactionary jingoists. The Soviet Union and the United States are at opposite poles among contemporary political systems. What I'm saying is that even though they are at opposite poles, in some respects they behave alike. And that's for deep-seated reasons that have to do with the exercise of power and institutions and so on. And that has nothing to do with moral equivalence.
You do admit that we are a free society. That
I admit it. I insist upon it. I insist that we are a free society and that the Soviet Union is a dungeon, and therefore we have completely different methods of population control, completely different methods. In fact, I've written a lot about this. There's no moral equivalence here. The totalitarian, I mean, there's no state is truly totalitarian, but as we move toward the totalitarian end of the spectrum, the technique of control is roughly that satirized by Orwell. You have a center of truth. You have a ministry of truth. It announces official truths. People can believe it or not. Nobody cares very much. It's sufficient that they obey. Totalitarian states can be more or less behavioristic. They don't really care what people think, because they always have a club at hand to beat them over the head if they do the wrong thing.
Force people to do what they want to do.
As long as they can think what they like in private, but they better do what we tell them in public. That's the model towards which totalitarian states tend. As a result, the propaganda may very well be not too effective. On the other hand, a democratic state can't use those mechanisms.
Can't force anybody to.
You can't force people. Therefore, you have to control what they think. Since power is still concentrated, but in different hands in our society, largely in private ownership, and you can't control people by force, you'd better care what they think. So that's why you have to have other forms, and in fact more sophisticated forms of indoctrination.
I did an interview once with Edward Bernays, who is considered the pioneering figure in American business public relations, and he talked through there about the engineering of consent.
Yeah, that's his phrase. Yeah. And he thought it's a wonderful thing. In fact, he described it as the essence of democracy.
Yeah, he said if the consent of the government presupposes that efforts at persuasion, at trying to persuade people to see things your way.
Notice the picture. The picture is certain people are in a position to persuade, and the essence of democracy is that they have the freedom to persuade. Now, who has the freedom to persuade? Well, who runs the public relations industry? It's not the special interests. They're the targets of the public relations industry. Public relations industry is a major industry, closely linked to other corporations. And those are the people who have the power to persuade. That's the essence of democracy. Yeah, and they must engineer the consent of others.
There was a vice president of AT&T in 1909 who said that he thought the public mind was the chief danger to the company.
Corporation. Exactly. The general public might have funny ideas about corporate control. For example, you know, people who really believe in democracy, people who take 18th century values seriously, people who really might merit the term conservatives, that much abused term, are against concentration of power. They remember that after all, the doctrines of the Enlightenment held that individuals should be free from the coercion of concentrated power. Now, the kind of concentrated power that they were thinking about was the church and the state and the feudal system and so on. And you could sort of imagine a population of relatively equal people, at least equal white male property owners, who would be not controlled by those private powers. But in the subsequent period, a new form of power developed, namely corporations, with highly concentrated power over decision-making in economic life. That is, they control over what's produced, what's distributed, what's invested, and so on and so forth, is very narrowly concentrated.
So this is why the vice president of a large corporation would say the public mind is the chief thing.
The public mind might have funny ideas about democracy, which say that we should not be forced simply to rent ourselves to the people who own the country, and own its institutions. Rather, we should play a role in determining what those institutions do. That's democracy. If we were to move towards democracy, and I think democracy even in the 18th century sense, we would say that there should be no maldistribution of power in determining what's produced, what's distributed, what's invested, and so on. Rather, that should be, that's a problem for the entire community. In fact, there are, in my own personal view, unless we move in that direction, human society probably isn't going to survive.
Why?
Well, we now face the most awesome problems of human history, problems such as the likelihood of nuclear conflict, either among the superpowers or through proliferation, the destruction of a fragile environment, which finally we're beginning to recognize that was obvious decades ago that we're heading for disaster. Other problems of this nature, they're of a level of seriousness that they never were in the past.
But why do you think more participation by the public, more democracy is the answer?
Because, well, more democracy is a value in itself. So quite apart, because democracy is a value, it doesn't have to be defended any more than freedom has to be defended. It's just, it's part of, it's an essential feature of human nature that people should be free, they should be able to participate, they should be uncoerced, and so on. These are values in themselves.
Well, why do you think, if we go that route...
Because I think that that's the only hope that I can see, that other values will come to the fore. I mean, if the society is based on control by private wealth, it will reflect the values that it in fact does reflect, the value that the only real human property is the desire is greed and the desire to maximize personal gain at the expense of others. Now, any society, maybe a small society based on that principle is ugly, but it can survive. A global society based on that principle is headed for massive destruction, and that's what we are.